welcome back to the second session of this this workshop on bioprinting and regulation. And obviously the first session dealt with one particular aspect of how we actually get the benefits of bioprinting. This session will focus more on what the regulatory hurdles are, and Matt will be talking about that. And then we have, so Matt Rimmer, his title is Hospitals of the Future, Bioprinting, Intellectual Property, Innovation Law and Public Health. So broadening on from the discussion that we've had already. And then Angela Daly will be talking, focusing on talking to experts, what we're learning about medical 3D printing, regulation and innovation from 3D PIP, is that right?
3D PIP futures.
3D PIP futures. So Angela will explain all about that in her presentation. And sorry for acronyming the acronym. So I think, is it good, Matt, if we have questions at the end of each presentation or at the end of the whole together? Okay, yeah. I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much.
And I'll keep you on track for about 20 minutes max.
That'd be good.
Okay.
So my presentation is really about bioprinting regulation and really looking at the West world that currently exists in terms of dealing with the law and ethics of bioprinting. And to make some of our later presenters feel at home who are doing work on some of the creative aspects of bioprinting, I thought it'd be a useful beginning point to start with Westworld. And I've been doing my research and looking at the special deluxe Blu-ray version of Westworld, in which they talked about how this opening sequence was really inspired by current 3D printing, and they are looking for ways of expanding upon that and thinking about the future projections of that technology. Something old and something new, so kind of a mechanical piano in the background. But very kind of interested in the convergence of different technologies. 3D printing, AI, robotics, IT, big data. But in its own way, it's very much kind of concerned with ELSI themes. It's concerned about the law and ethics of 3D printing and bioprinting, and the arrogance and hubris of technology developers, and what motivates them, and what responsibilities they have towards their invention. So when I was first a student of technology law, a couple of decades ago, there was a very famous Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace by Barlow, and he kind of talked a lot about the difficulties of regulating the new field of cyberspace, and kind of compared it to the Wild West and suggested that it wasn't going to be the case in which law and justice ruled. Often disputes would be worked out in terms of social norms and the operation of the marketplace, but also in terms of some dust-ups and conflicts between the different stakeholders. So, starting with Westworld, I'm also echoing back that kind of moment in technology law, but also I really wanted to kind of amplify what Nicol and Nelson said in terms of we understand the current debate over bioprinting regulation in light of this strata of previous discussions in relation to the regulation of life sciences. So much like Nicol and Nelson, I've kind of gone back to the 1970s. I visited the Bancroft Library and looked at all the oral histories of the inventors of the biotechnology industry in the 1970s. They initially thought that biotechnology was quite a pure science, and you have these amazing insights in terms of first contact between biotechnology and the law, working through some of the legal and ethical issues like intellectual property, but also in terms of regulatory regimes. So my kind of suggestion is that with bioprinting, we have kind of echoes of some of those first contact moments that we had in relation to some of the other fields of technology that we've explored in the past. Just a kind of a quick little introduction about myself. I'm a professor of IP and innovation law. I've done a lot of work on gene patents and access to essential medicines and health-related issues in the past. And really this work on 3D printing and bioprinting comes out of that. We have an ever-growing group in terms of doing work on intellectual property and innovation law. We've kind of grown to 13 just recently, and we have an array of different researchers doing work across a variety of different fields, including international trade and sustainable development, intellectual property, privacy, free speech and human rights, innovation law, open access and the Creative Commons. Our kind of work on 3D printing and bioprinting is really part of the work that we're doing in relation to innovation law and innovation policy. Really our work is the union of a number of different projects. So I'm a chief investigator in relation to intellectual property and 3D printing, and a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Hope Johnson and Dr. Kylie Pappalardo, are ARC postdoctoral fellows working on that project. My colleague, Dr. Angela Daly, also has her own project looking at 3D printing across an array of different jurisdictions, which kind of builds upon her very pioneering research in the field of 3D printing regulation. And Dr. Angela Daly and I have done a lot of events together on 3D printing and bioprinting, but I should duly acknowledge that a lot of my own work has been influenced by her very kind of path-breaking work in the field, and I would highly recommend her book on the topic, which is a great account of some of the first contact conflicts over intellectual property and 3D printing regulation. As I kind of noted in my prologue, we're kind of at a really kind of interesting moment in relation to dealing with an array of legal, ethical and social issues in relation to bioprinting and 3D printing. In Westworld, there's a very nice intellectual property theme working its way through the television series. Do you know how far these people will go to protect their intellectual property? It's also kind of quite nice because the original inventor of Westworld was Michael Crichton, more famous for Jurassic World and Jurassic Park, was always very kind of picked upon fears and anxieties about new technologies, but was also a very ardent critic of gene patents. So towards the end of his life, before he kind of died of cancer, he wrote these stinging critiques in the New York Times about the rise of gene patents and how something should be done about it before the myriad decisions. So I think it's quite a rich cultural text that kind of picks up on a number of different kind of themes and sentiments. I mean, it's also kind of quite good at picking up upon the hype cycle and the boosterism that exists about new disruptive emerging technologies that come around. It's quite good at documenting that and looking at the ways in which corporations try to appropriate new disruptive technologies one way or another. So I think it's kind of an interesting piece. The Harvard Law School bioethicist Professor Glenn Cohen has also said that it's a really useful kind of work about bioethics and the relationship between humans and robots, and is kind of quite intriguing in terms of some of those issues and some of those questions. And it certainly has been a kind of an obsession in terms of popular culture. So 3D printing and bioprinting has appeared in lots of other popular works of culture, like The Fifth Element and The Avengers, Age of Ultron. You can pick out in Spider-Man Homecoming the odd 3D printer in the labs there. So in terms of the cultural zeitgeist, there's a lot of interest and obsession with 3D printing and bioprinting, but also perhaps some unrealistic expectations about the potential and maturity of the technology. Here at QUT, there's been a great interest in terms of 3D printing, particularly in terms of some of its applications in relation to health and medicine and biotechnology. We've already had a really useful foundational summary from Nicole Nelson. I just kind of add that the Public Knowledge Group have been doing a lot of work on public policy surrounding 3D printing regulation. In one of their Friends of the Court briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States, they noted that additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, is an emerging field that is potentially revolutionary in its applications. Generally speaking, 3D printing is a set of technologies for using computer-controlled machinery to manufacture parts or devices. The promise of 3D printing is remarkable. Personalised medical implants and prosthetics can be custom-made to fit individual patients. Owners of machines can manufacture replacement parts on the fly. Manufacturers can quickly prototype new ideas at much lower costs, dramatically reducing research and development cycles. And creative individuals and businesses can use the flexibility of the technology to explore ideas such as 3D printed clothing, 3D printed houses, and even 3D printed food. And within our group, we've tried to kind of break off different elements of 3D printing to kind of have a look at some of the legal and ethical implications. So a year ago, we had a big event looking at 3D printing law and policy. Early this year, we had an event looking at designs and 3D printing. And today, we're really focusing upon 3D printing in healthcare. And we hope in the coming year to do some more work in relation to 3D printing in food and 3D printing in culture. I guess one of the important points to reinforce is that we don't necessarily know the mature applications of 3D printing yet. There's lots of ambition and hope and promise about the various different applications of 3D printing, but some of those expectations have already been disappointed. So a few years ago there was high hopes for the retail sector, for consumer 3D printing and a 3D printer being in every home, and really those expectations were not met. 3D printers were not like the new Apple Mac, and with the personal computer revolution, they still seem to be the preserve of professionals and the industry in terms of manufacturing and other sectors. But we have seen a kind of a rise of 3D printing in relation to industrial applications. There's a lot of interest in terms of some of the health applications in relation to 3D printing. But one would also say then the life sciences, there are a whole range of other subfields of the life sciences that also made very kind of bold, revolutionary promises, and it's a very kind of competitive space. It's not necessarily clear yet that 3D printing or bioprinting is going to have comparative advantages relative to some of the other new fields that have been coming along, like genomics and proteomics and synthetic biology, and some of the other new areas that Daly was talking about in terms of gene editing. So I think it's useful to have that in terms of it's a very competitive space. We're not quite sure yet what's going to be the full mature promise in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. And I guess my kind of talk is kind of particularly about the relationship between regulation and intellectual property, but I think I'll focus upon regulation in particular. I think Daly kind of talked very nicely about the regulatory soup that exists in relation to bioprinting, how it cuts across a tangled web of a variety of different legal regimes. And historically, that has often been very problematic. So access to essential medicines and pharmaceutical drugs, there's been a big debate about the issue of linkage. So Orrin Hatch and Henry Waxman passed the Hatch-Waxman Act and tied the IP regime to the regulatory regime for pharmaceutical drugs. And that has been the source of a lot of angst and grief in terms of established pharmaceutical drug companies using those regimes in such a way as to try to shut out generic competition in various different ways. So the debate about linkage is a quite important one, and is a useful reminder that these disciplines are not separate and autonomous from one another. They interact with one another in very profound ways. As we heard before in relation to stem cell research, there are very strong interactions. So for the battles over patents in Australia, they kind of raised larger questions about whether certain inventions were contrary to law. So prohibitions in terms of regulatory regime led to certain patent applications being rejected on the basis that they were contrary to law, as well as violating sections 18 subsection 2 of the Patent Act. But my talk today is really about the the relationship between regulation and innovation. And I'd just like to kind of begin with a little example of a pioneering instance of the use of 3D printing and bioprinting in Queensland in particular. Brisbane-born surgeon Dr. Paul D'Urso applied from a grant from the Princess Alexandra Hospital Research Foundation to investigate combining 3D printing and 3D imaging technology to print models of organs or bones back in the 1990s. He was awarded $1,200 to look into it and later completed a PhD into the applications of the technology. So, although there's a long prehistory in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting, he noted, after my PhD, I worked with other surgeons to develop a 3D printed cranial reconstructive implant in 1993 for someone's head. It was the first 3D printed implant in the world. I worked at the Mater Children's Hospital at the Craniofacial Clinic. We had kids from all over the South Pacific with terrible facial deformities, and we started making custom models to reconstruct their skulls. The Mater Children's was the first hospital in the world to start doing this. Brisbane is a world leader in all of this, and Australia is still leading the world in the field. He set up his own company in 1996 and exports 3D printed implants to 30 countries. He's done things like included a titanium printed heel implant to save the leg of a cancer patient, and a sternum and partial rib cage for a cancer patient in Spain. Paul is very frustrated about the regulatory system that exists in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. I don't necessarily entirely agree with his position, but I think it's kind of worthwhile taking you through his position because I think it's quite representative, particularly amongst technology developers. He says, we have a regulatory system that was invented last century to deal with mass manufactured products where you needed foundries and factories, but the whole world has changed. 3D printing allows for distributed manufacturing. It brings the technology and manufacturing capability out of the factories and into the communities. This is technology that was invented in Australia. We can do this ourselves. We don't need to import these products, but most of the implants we use are imported. Every time I make an implant for a patient, I've got to write to the Health Fund and ask for permission to be paid and explain why a patient-specific 3D printed implant is better than an off-the-shelf factory-produced one from America. Months pass, the patient is screaming out for the operation, the surgeon ends up going with the off-the-shelf product. This is the sort of insane system we have. We're crying out to change the regulatory system in Australia. We have to give up this idea that multinational corporations need to make these products and stop importing stuff back at a 40% premium. And he essentially would like changes to the regulatory regime, but also for Australia to be a kind of a centre of work in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. And other surgeons and researchers have expressed some similar views while kind of highlighting the possible benefits of the technology. So Kevin Tetsworth, an orthopedic surgeon at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, essentially helped Callum Harwood, a car crash victim on the Sunshine Coast, and he received custom designed 3D printed implants at the hospital in 2016. And Callum, he said, had a terrible injury, and essentially as a result of various collaborations, they designed a special implant which replaced some of the missing cartilage and supported a bone graft. And he noted without a custom-made implant, it would have been impossible. Nothing off the shelf would have worked, and he would have had a mid-femur amputation. And he noted, I've been a surgeon for 30 years, and this is a very exciting time to be in medicine. So there's been a lot of interest in changing and shifting some of the rules in relation to the regulation of 3D printing and bioprinting, and we see kind of cross currents in different jurisdictions. So in the United States, we have had researchers like Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford University who have been arguing that we're really shifting from an age of artificial scarcity to one of great abundance, and we need to start rethinking some of our regulatory models in relation to 3D printing. Jasper Tran kind of makes the very good point that we can't just treat bioprinting like other forms of 3D printing or other forms of manufacturing. There are some very special considerations that are apparent in relation to bioprinting. The United States government was very enthusiastic about supporting 3D printing and bioprinting, particularly to boost jobs, education and innovation. When I was in the United States in 2014, I saw members of the Maker Caucus who had been set up in the United States Congress to help support legislative and public policy initiatives in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. I was at meetings where I saw a very kind of interesting interaction between members of the Food and Drug Administration and technology developers as they tried to informally discuss with one another what needed to be done in terms of navigating current pathways in relation to regulatory rules, in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. And that kind of reached a high point in which President Barack Obama hosted his own Maker Fair at the White House and showcased all the various different forms of 3D printing and bioprinting that was kind of going on. Since then, we've had a rather abrupt shift and change in terms of regulatory models in the United States, and I think it is a very kind of profound one. We do need to have to think about models and theories of regulation. Obama had a very particular model of regulation that he wanted to kind of achieve in terms of supporting innovation. President Donald Trump has quite a different philosophy and is very much about reducing the role of government and reducing the role of regulators and cutting back and deconstructing the regulatory state in an array of different ways, including in relation to food and health. So there's big questions there in terms of how the Food and Drug Administration is going to operate in terms of dealing with 3D printing and bioprinting. So Trump's new head of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, this month has released his new guidelines on the regulation of bioprinting, which is kind of an interesting read. And he's kind of noted his kind of approach in relation to the topic. So, technical considerations for additive manufactured medical devices, guidance for industry and Food and Drug Administration staff. So you kind of have this effort to build greater administrative guidelines. He kind of emphasises some of the benefits from 3D printed medical products through access to personalised devices and innovative drugs. He kind of notes there's a need for a more comprehensive regulatory pathway. He's noted that the FDA has reviewed more than 100 devices currently on the market, and our great VRES student, Jonathan Hoare, was busy digging through all the various applications that have been made last year. The FDA has tried to build facilities to help them assess what's been going on, but there's also obviously a huge driver in terms of the drug industry wanting to use 3D printing to manufacture drugs. So we have this new clarification, which includes various approaches to 3D printing, including device design, testing of products for function, durability and quality systems requirements. And the hope is that it will help manufacturers bring their innovations to market more efficiently by providing a transparent process for future submissions and making sure our regulatory approach is properly tailored to the unique opportunities and challenge posed by this promising new technology. My fear is the one that Professor Larry Gostin has kind of talked about, which is deregulation and really attacks upon the independence and autonomy of regulators. So my concern is that under the Trump administration, the drug industry, the medical industry and the biotechnology industry is going to place greater pressure upon the regulator to fast-track applications and not perhaps consider the full health and safety consequences in relation to new technologies. And as Naomi Klein kind of points out, that could be hugely problematic, particularly in relation to food and health, but also in relation to other areas as well. Can I have 5 more minutes, Diane? Yep. Yeah. There's been some very kind of parallel developments going on in Australia with the Therapeutic Goods Administration. In Australia, you have very similar patterns in terms of a great interest in 3D printing and bioprinting and additive manufacturing, boosting innovation and education and jobs. So in Queensland, as part of the Advanced Manufacturing Action Plan, there's a very kind of key focus that Australia could have a niche speciality in 3D printing and additive manufacturing and bioprinting, and the ministers for the last administration were very enthusiastic about that. The Innovation Minister, the Development Minister and the various other stakeholders, including the Treasurer. The Queensland Government is being reconstituted at the moment and some of the portfolios are being shifted around, but they seem to be very committed to supporting advanced manufacturing in Queensland, as well as some other states as well. So Victoria and South Australia are very kind of concerned about the depressed manufacturing sectors with the departure of some of the old car industries. There's a great interest in trying to transition to different forms of economic arrangements, and there's certainly a kind of interest in relation to healthcare, and the University of Tasmania obviously has a deep interest in relation to bioprinting and 3D printing as well for very similar reasons and considerations. At a national level, the federal government has certainly given special emphasis to additive manufacturing in general and advanced manufacturing, but more particularly in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting. Christopher Pyne, who was at one point Innovation Minister, and the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, have been very keen on boosting our ability in relation to research and development in emerging technologies. So Turnbull's great despair is that Australia does wonderful science and research, but is not very good at translating that into industry outcomes. He kind of laments that scientists and researchers lack entrepreneurial skills and legal skills and business skills. So his philosophy in terms of transforming the education system seems very much focused on ensuring that we better translate our research into commercialisation in various different ways. There has been concerns about how that policy is working in practice. So the Productivity Commission has been quite critical about the federal innovation policy in terms of it saying it's very hard to evaluate how successful it has been, but it's also been kind of concerned about the very ad hoc nature of innovation policy development. So they kind of know that there's a lot of new fab spaces and maker spaces and clinics that have been set up, but there's a lack of scale and perhaps a lack of coherence in terms of the approach to innovation in Australia, and that has meant we're not necessarily internationally competitive. As Nicol and Nelson has also mentioned, the Productivity Commission has done a huge review of intellectual property arrangements in Australia and has argued we need to refine our intellectual property laws to improve our position. So, much like the United States, there's been a consultation by the Therapeutic Goods Administration in terms of regulatory changes related to personalised and 3D printed medical devices. I'm running slightly short of time, so I won't go through the whole thing. But I would note that I'm concerned about the process. Much like the ABS and census fail, I note that the consultation's due date is deep in December, just before Christmas. You're not necessarily going to have a good public process of consultation if you set your process up in such a way. Likewise, the consultation process seems to be very focused upon the relationship between technology developers and the regulator, and I guess my concern is where are the voices looking after consumer rights and public health and some of the end users, particularly thinking about some of the past battles in terms of access to medicines. The beneficiaries of new technologies do need to be included in these discussions and these debates very early on. So you're most welcome to have a read of the proposed regulatory changes related to personalised and 3D printed medical devices. I'm optimistic about the process in the sense of it's good that there is a discussion taking place, because often in the past, particularly in some of the genetic fields, we've had discussions and nothing happens. So Di and others were doing work on genetic discrimination, genetic privacy with Natasha Stott-Spoy and others 20 years ago, and those issues were not properly dealt with, and now we're facing the consequences of that. But as I kind of mentioned, I mean, it's a very technocratic effort to rework the regulations that exist. So there's new definitions for personalised devices, proposals for changes to the custom-made conformity assessment procedure changes to the definition of manufacturer, new classifications for anatomical models, new arrangements for devices with human material. I guess the other point to make is that it happens at the context in which the TGA is under huge public pressure in terms of its legitimacy. So there's this massive litigation going on at the moment over pelvic mesh run by Shine lawyers. Huge questions about public confidence and trust and the legitimacy of the TGA as a result of this litigation. But really complex and difficult questions about, is the regulator doing its job, or is it too quickly approving new technologies? And what happens when that takes place? So my colleague Dr. Daly in her book kind of highlights how we have to focus upon product liability. I think one of the really strong themes coming out of her book is that there's been a lot of attention about battles over 3D printed guns, but maybe we should be much more concerned about quality issues in relation to the products that are developed. And I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the pelvic mesh litigation in terms of some of the issues we need to think about in terms of 3D printing and bioprinting. Similar issues in the European Union, and maybe Angela will talk about those. I think it's important to raise larger questions in terms of human rights and health and integrity and dignity. So Temma Minson and Mark Mimia kind of note it's not enough just to think about the question about technological change, you have to think about the human impact of these changes. And they kind of note 3D printing and bioprinting as an enormous game changer that needs to be monitored very carefully and might require forceful and concerted interventions. Only then will it be possible to meet public policy objectives and find a reasonable balance between the prevention of misuses and the realisation of enormous benefits that will certainly result from the fascinating technology. My strategic conclusion would be, maybe for 3D printing and bioprinting, it would be a good idea to have high standards of regulation to avoid potential issues in terms of quality or potential litigation in the future. Perhaps if you want to be strategic, high levels of regulation might ensure greater quality control, greater benefits. It might lead to a slower progression in terms of the rollout of the technology, but perhaps that is a really important factor in terms of ensuring public confidence and trust. So while I understand the impatience of surgeons and technology developers to rush ahead and not have bureaucratic red tape holding them up, the history of the life sciences would suggest that sometimes it's really important to think about these questions about regulation and risk. Anyway, that's all for me. Sorry for taking a little bit longer than I expected to.
Thanks very much, Matt. And I think there's probably food for lots and lots of questions in that presentation, particularly those issues that you get to at the end. So, but we'll hold off for now on questions and get Angela to do her presentation on learning from experts, or talking to experts.
Talking and hopefully learning as well.
It would be good to have that intersection.
This is actually going to be a much shorter presentation than Matthew's one, so I don't think we should run over time. What I'm going to present today is actually some of the very initial findings from this 3D printing and intellectual property futures project that Matthew mentioned that I am undertaking, and particularly those findings that are of relevance to the topic of today's workshop. So bioprinting, but probably medical 3D printing more broad, 3D printing in the medical sphere rather than just bioprinting as such. So as Matthew mentioned, my previous research ended up being this book, which did touch upon medical device regulation as well as various other areas of law when it comes to 3D printing and some of the kind of more general socio-legal questions around 3D printing. I'm a socio-legal academic, so my work is generally in law, but with using methods which are not always legal methods. So that book was very much kind of taking that approach. And I looked at developments in, I guess, Western global North countries particularly English-speaking countries and the European Union, which is quite typical of a lot of the research from law and the social sciences around 3D printing. My current work is this 3D PIP Futures project, which is funded by the UK Intellectual Property Office. We're about halfway through the project at the moment, and we have a multidisciplinary and multinational project team, one of whom is in the audience and will be speaking a little bit later as well. So the idea of this project was to try and get a broader, or create a broader base of knowledge and research on 3D printing, on the relationship between 3D printing and intellectual property, but broadening out the existing research to look specifically at countries outside of those ones that I was looking at in my previous work. So specifically, we have been looking at developments to some extent, yes, in the EU, US, and UK since I published my book, and since some of the rest of us did other work on 3D printing. But what I think is particularly novel about, one of the things that is novel about this project is that we have been undertaking work, research in China, India, Russia, and Singapore as well, to try and understand a kind of more global view of what is happening with 3D printing and intellectual property. The other innovative part of this project, I would say, is the methodology that we're using. So we are conducting innovative horizon scanning workshops with experts in these different countries in order to have a view that goes outside the sort of academic, legal, or academic, strictly academic sort of social science view as well of what is happening with 3D printing and what potential future scenarios might be for 3D printing in general, its relationship with intellectual property, and what advice we may be able to give to the funding body about what they should do around their own policies, practices, and potential lobbying for law reform in the UK as well. So horizon scanning is this innovative methodology we're using is a qualitative social science methodology, and the aim with using this methodology is to move away from technologically deterministic views of the future, to try and kind of understand some of the other factors beyond the technology itself that may shape the relationship between, in this case, 3D printing and intellectual property. And by doing this, we hope to have a kind of better understanding of how that relationship may be progressing and how it may also differ in different places and different parts of the world as well. What we've done so far is we've had a pilot workshop which was completed in Brisbane earlier this year, and we have then undertaken 4 of the kind of main workshops in the locations on this slide. So we, Moscow, or Roorkee near Delhi in India, Singapore, and Shenzhen in China, and that's the photo of the Shenzhen workshop. And we've got 2 more workshops coming up in Paris and London in the next couple of months. What we do with these workshops is that we invite experts, around kind of 10 to 15 experts from different stakeholder groups with some knowledge of 3D printing ideally, or knowledge or experience or in a kind of relevant other area. So we have IP, at this workshop we had intellectual property lawyers, for instance, who maybe didn't have a great knowledge of 3D printing, but they could kind of enlighten us as to what was happening in China around the sort of IP discussions more generally, and to what extent they had come across 3D printing. Our hypothesis is that the kind of 3D printing and intellectual property future will be different in different countries. It may have a different, people from different industries may have different views of what that future might look like, and specifically different intellectual property rights, so copyrights, patents, trademarks, design rights, trade secrets, and so on. The kind of future outlook for those rights may be different as well. They may have different futures for copyright compared to patents. I'm going to kind of give some of the broad initial findings at the moment from the tentative findings as well. So that's the big caveat. And then in the next slide, I'll explain some of the findings that are more relevant to medical 3D printing. So firstly, there definitely are some similarities across the different countries we've looked at so far. From what I understand of what the participants were kind of telling me, and in the other workshops as well, no one is seeing a near-term existential threat to the intellectual property system from 3D printing. And that's, I think, quite important given some of the earlier literature around 3D printing, as Matthew mentioned, Mark Lemley, for instance, we're kind of hypothesizing that 3D printing may be kind of fatal to intellectual property laws and practices if they weren't kind of worn down enough by like digitization and the internet. Then 3D printing would kind of kill them off entirely. There would be kind of mass scale infringement, and that this would be sort of uncontrollable. In reality, for various reasons, including the lack of ubiquity of 3D printers in people's houses and workplaces, the lack of kind of functionality of cheap 3D printers and so on, this threat does not really seem to be manifesting itself in reality. So I think that's one important thing, and that seems to be a fairly similar kind of view expressed across different the different countries we've been working in. Just to kind of give some of the sort of divergent findings from some of the workshops. For instance, in what we found in China is that people thought that intellectual property litigation around 3D printing would probably increase. There has been some litigation already, but people thought that that would actually increase. But while on the other hand, people also thought that if 3D printing was to have a broader take-up, then more open access approaches were necessary. So people identified the expiry of key patents, and actually in many of the workshops, people identified the expiry of certain key patents relating to 3D printing machines as being a kind of very important sort of event for the take-up of 3D printing in that particular country. But certainly in China, on the one hand, people thought there would be more litigation around IP, but also that if there were more open approaches to IP, there would be more take-up of 3D printing. Singapore, interestingly, particularly for this group, people at that workshop seem to think that medical regulation, medical device regulation, safety, regulation, product liability was more important to them and to their functions and their activities than intellectual property. And in Russia, one of the big kind of findings from that workshop was that whereas in other places there did not seem to be particular problems with access to 3D printing design files, for some reason in Russia that was viewed as being a big barrier to take up by people there for 3D printing. And so I think it's interesting for those who may have some experience of kind of the internet and digitization, this idea of the kind of splinternet or balkanization of the internet, where you have kind of different internets in different countries. There may be something similar happening with 3D printing, so different trajectories for 3D printing in different countries, and some of these findings may bear that out, that there are different challenges that people are facing, particularly in the Chinese context. This is slightly of a slight divergence, I guess, that the kinds of places that people are getting content from are quite different to the kinds of places people are getting content from in the West. So there are different companies, different kinds of services and different models, which also it can be compared to the Chinese approach to the internet too, which is quite different. One has quite different actors there than in the West, for instance. Okay, so some more specific findings around 3D printing in the medical sphere. Of the workshops that we've undertaken so far, there seemed to be most interest in medical 3D printing from participants in the Singapore workshop. So we have kind of more material from that workshop around 3D printing, which may be to do with the kinds of people that we had as experts in that workshop. Quite a few of them were working on 3D printing in the medical sphere themselves in various different ways. But also I think that is indicative of the fact that, for instance, in Singapore, there's a lot of money being invested in 3D printing activity and research in the medical field, which participants viewed as being linked to the aging population in Singapore. So the Singaporean government was investing in 3D printing, they viewed as a result of these kind of socio or demographic changes, I guess. But interestingly, one of the findings, or one of the kind of comments that was made was that there was kind of significant barriers to adoption in Singapore of medical 3D printing. So obviously regulatory approval, which I think is a fairly sort of common a fairly common sort of barrier, but also perhaps more interestingly, it was necessary, they viewed it necessary for doctors and other medical professionals to actually kind of accept this technology as being useful, and in their view, that would not, there may be a need to kind of convince those medical professionals that actually using 3D printed parts or would be useful for their medical practice. So kind of resistance or small c conservatism from those people may be our participants viewed as a barrier to adoption of 3D printing in the medical sphere. And also, I mean, I think this is something that's come out from other workshops as well, is that people viewed 3D printing very much as a complementary technology and not a full replacement for existing manufacturing techniques in general, but also in the medical sphere. So it would be used in some cases, but perhaps not in other cases when it's kind of appropriate to whatever object people are trying to print. In our Shenzhen workshop, there was not a huge amount of discussion around medical 3D printing, but one thing that the participants seemed to kind of strongly agree on was that a barrier to adoption there, particularly of bioprinting or printed organs, if we actually get to that stage where they are kind of widely available, people viewed that kind of what they identified as sort of Chinese cultural attitudes around organ transplantation and body modification coming from, I guess, some Confucian ideas about the integrity of the body. They viewed that as being a potential barrier to the general public's acceptance of like 3D printed organs or body parts. Okay, so I'm kind of pretty much at the end now, and I think I just wanted to kind of emphasize that what is the point in talking to experts? Well, I think that we've discovered from talking to experts in different countries that the barriers or getting 3D printing to be used and accepted in the medical sphere is not just a question of technology or law specifically, that there are kind of other things at play which can be government innovation policies, kind of encouraging the particular investment and kind of take up of certain technologies, as we can see in Singapore, but people's kind of attitudes, cultural preferences, and particularly those who are in a decision-making capacity as medical professionals, there may be attitudes that are not so conducive to the take-up of 3D printing, and that might serve as a barrier in itself, which is something that's not really, from what my impression, being discussed in the literature so far around 3D printing and regulation in particular. So I think that it is worthwhile talking to experts to kind of try and understand these kind of perhaps more silent or hidden barriers that may actually kind of shape how the technology kind of continues. Just to say that what's next in this project, we've got a couple more workshops to do in Europe, but around this time next year, we will produce a final report with all of this research in it for the UK Intellectual Property Office, which will be publicly accessible, and we will also probably be engaging or writing some academic publications and doing other outreach activities. But if you're interested in kind of seeing the progress of our project, we've got a Twitter account, 3DPIP Futures, and also a website, which I think is 3dpipfutures.com. And there's also a little bit more information about some of the workshops we've conducted already there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Session. I know we've got a long lunch break, so if I could get the ball rolling, it's really interesting to see how we collect evidence on attitudes towards 3D printing and indeed what the real issues are. And it brings me back to a paper that colleagues led by Tim Caulfield, one of the leading international commentators on biomedicine and gene patents. They published an article called Evidence and Anecdotes in 2006. And I think that illustrates the issue of when you're looking at opinions, collecting opinions, when do anecdotes become evidence? And we've seen anecdotes there, the surgeon anecdotes on what their views are and the evidence that you can get from talking to experts in the field. So how do we do that? How do we move from evidence to anecdotes in a field like this, and how much indeed should that influence law and policy?
I think one does have to be kind of cautious about, or even the findings that I was presenting as being sort of illustrative perhaps or indicative, but not necessarily the basis themselves to make sort of strong policy around. But I think that certainly in 3D printing there's been a lack of empirical sort of social science research on 3D printing, particularly outside of, I guess, the global north. And so I think kind of building that body of research is important, and the greater the body of research we have, I think the more evidence we may get, but also using different kinds of methods is important as well. So
I think it's a really good question to ask. Shabina from the University of Michigan has a nice comment recently, you know, when people talk about evidence-based policy making, what do they actually mean? Whose evidence and whose views are going to be taken into account? I do think there are some methodological tensions in terms of qualitative versus quantitative approaches. I think the work of Dr. Daly really highlights the great value and significance of doing empirical research, doing interview-based research and workshop-based research in looking at what is happening in relation to certain sorts of technologies. We've learned from what has happened with the FDA and the TGA that bureaucratic knowledge sometimes is inadequate and limited and has its own biases, and we need to take into account that as well. But I think for new technologies there's an interesting weave there in terms of having to consider all sorts of cultural discourses around a technology as well. And in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting, you have at one and the same time a very kind of utopian discourse. So we just have a new book by Mark Hatch, which is just next to you, hiding under there, about the maker revolution, which is very enthusiastic about 3D printing and bioprinting and how it will reshape manufacturing and innovation and healthcare. And then you have some quite dystopian discourses as well, like Westworld is one of those, but you certainly have some very fearful discourses in relation to new technologies. And I do think it's kind of important to engage with those and kind of sort out sometimes what they're tapping into. Is it factual? Is it fantasy or fictional? So I think a multifaceted approach is a good one. Sometimes anecdotes are really important in terms of they represent larger conflicts. So the myriad litigation was often dismissed of is only a particular dispute. But patents are so powerful, they can really affect whole marketplaces in certain sorts of ways. So I think a case study approach is sometimes really useful and helpful to work out what's going on. But good questions in terms of methodology.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Kelly.
I have a question for Matt. You finished off saying that maybe the answer is more regulation. And I was wondering how confident you are that regulation imposed on these technologies will be through regulation. Does that require a fair bit of faith in our system?
Well, I think the history of science and technology has been a very mixed one in relation to regulation. So in your own discipline of copyright law and intermediary liability, there have been instances where there's been premature regulation of an area. So our rules in copyright law are based on 1990s internet, before search engines and social media and a whole wide range of other things became important. So it is possible to prematurely try to regulate an area and over-regulation to have some quite adverse impacts. I think there are also problems of a very laissez-faire approach to regulation, of just hoping and wishing that the marketplace will sort things out. And we've seen in relation to genetics and bioethics that that hasn't been the case. So sometimes you can have issues in terms of late regulation as well. There's always tensions, I think, that are coming out from all the presentations thus far between technology neutral approaches and technology specific approaches and technology contextual approaches in relation to regulating 3D printing. and our pure hopes for a technology neutral approach have always been thwarted one way or another. So I lack confidence in terms of levels of regulation, but that is also related to questions about the evolution of regulation. So having been at the ANU and being taught by Peter Drahos and John Braithwaite, there's whole bodies of research on regulation and co-option of regulators and the difficulties of ensuring independent, autonomous, responsive regulators. Nonetheless, I think it's still worthwhile fighting for there to be good regulators in the space. And I guess my plea is also, you know, public knowledge have been very good at trying to preempt a lot of the concerns about 3D printing in the United States Congress by having sympathetic legislators, doing early interventions. You know, I think the big danger for 3D printing or bioprinting, I don't know what Dr. Angela Daly thinks, is that it will have a crisis of a dangerous product, particularly in the health sector, which will undermine trust and confidence and lead to the field being affected. And we've seen that in past disciplines. So stem cell research made lots of promises that weren't fulfilled, badly affected by fraud. Biotech, that's been a big problem in terms of over-promising, very slow to produce the kind of benefits. But I think they're really good questions to ask. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Get the next question, just to keep things rolling on, if that's all right, Angela. Yeah.
So my question to Angela, I want to ask you about whether you're thinking of extending your research to other countries, mainly because you have spoken about emerging economies, China and India. So what about these developing countries? Do you think that we should get into the wagon of regulation, or they need to wait and see what will be the development taking place in other countries and think about other methods of regulation? And one more thing, do you think it's a good idea to differentiate your regulation, whether you are a user of technology or you're a importer of technology? Do you think this should be taken into consideration if you're thinking about all of those regulations happening overseas and you want to have them as well, but at the same time you need to have more kind of development perspective into your own laws and regulation? So how do you feel those issues should be dealt with in relation to regulation, especially, and I think it's a good idea just to look broader, because there are many countries which are now just importing, but they are not having any kind of technology, and it would be interesting to see how those countries will shape the future of regulation around this area.
Those are two huge questions. To answer your answer your first question, I would be really interested to do more work on this, but in the confines of this project, those are the countries that I mentioned are the only ones that we're looking at. I think there definitely could be quite a different story in non-BRICS countries in the global south, which with regards to 3D printing. Also, I mean, and Singapore is obviously a non-BRICS country, but it's a very wealthy economy as well. So, I mean, I think there's a lot more work to be done to kind of understand what is happening elsewhere, which there's almost no information about. There is a project in, I think based in South Africa, which is looking a bit at 3D printing kind of in South Africa, some of the legal and regulatory issues around that, and perhaps in some other Southern African countries. But that's the only one I know about, which is going to looking elsewhere. I'm not going to give a very good answer to, I suppose, your other questions, because I don't really know enough about it. I do, from the little that I do know, I think there is a concern that I mean, actually I wrote about this in my book, where a little bit about it anyway, where you have kind of, I suppose, development projects using 3D printing in the medical sphere, in fact, where there is not proper kind of regulation or oversight by kind of medical professionals, and there's a potential for, particularly prosthetics, in fact, to be kind of used and distributed that are not safe enough. And I know some of those projects are kind of doing that in developing countries. So I think safety remains a big concern kind of internationally, but I have to say I don't really know enough to kind of answer your question very well, and perhaps you know more, in fact, given your work in development. But I think definitely an interesting issue that should be.
I think ethical issues are really important as well, and also lots of talk about other social, so cultural issues, especially as Matt said, maybe he has some.
I think you make excellent points. At the beginning of this year, we had the Honourable Michael Kirby come along and talk about intellectual property and access to essential medicines. And his point was that there are very fundamental issues there in terms of human rights and sustainable development. And he was very concerned about the history of conflict over access to essential medicines. So it's certainly something that we need to keep in mind in terms of the next generation of developments in relation to biotech, because it will make a huge difference in terms of will the products of bioprinting just be available for a wealthy elite in developed countries, or will they be available in some of these mid-tier countries that Angela's been investigating? What about small island states and least developed countries? If you kind of take the approach of the importance of universal health care, those are really important issues to consider. In relation to 3D printing, there's often an open innovation culture, and at the moment there's a real struggle for the soul of 3D printing and bioprinting about whether it's going to go down a commercial route or a much more open access route. And I think there are some important considerations. But fortunately, we have a leading expert on 3D printing and development next. So I don't want to steal his thunder.
Can I just add one more thing? And I also don't want to preempt Thomas's presentation too much, but one thing that has been kind of discussed is the potential for 3D printing to kind of be a leapfrog technology for countries that we don't have sort of centralized kind of industrial manufacturing, in the same way that mobile phones have kind of been a leapfrog technology in places like India, where where at least there was not kind of a wired telecoms network throughout the whole country, or accessibility throughout the whole country. So there was not, unlike perhaps in the kind of industrialized global north countries, which went from kind of like a wired telephone network then to mobile phones, that kind of intermediate step can sometimes be surpassed. There has been a lot of discussion about 3D printing being used to kind of surpass sort of its large industrialized factories, but to what extent that's actually happening, I think, is a good question.
That's great, and it just shows again, as in the last session, we've got huge questions that are presently unanswerable, but that doesn't mean that we should not try to answer them. And it's good to have the discussion about what the pressing questions are that we really need to focus on over the coming years. So really great presentation by both of you. Thank you, and please join me in thanking both.